You don't get into trouble at a traffic stop when the ticket is written. You get into trouble much earlier, in a moment that feels so casual, so harmless, that most drivers don't even realize they've already made a mistake. It happens when the officer leans slightly closer, lowers their voice just enough to sound conversational, and asks a question that almost feels like small talk. Where are you coming from? Now, let me ask you something honestly. When you hear that question, do you answer quickly just to move things along? Or do you actually stop and think about what that answer might legally trigger? Go ahead and drop your answer in the comments, because what you do in that exact moment says more than you think. And by the end of this, you're going to see why so many people accidentally talk themselves into bigger problems without ever intending to. Here's the uncomfortable truth most drivers never hear. That question is not random. It is not just polite conversation. And it is definitely not as simple as it sounds. It is a doorway into your timeline, your behavior, your consistency, and sometimes your vulnerability. And once that doorway opens, everything you say after that gets filtered through it. Let's slow this down, because this is where people lose control of the situation without realizing it. When you're pulled over, your brain goes into a very specific mode. You're alert, slightly tense, trying to be cooperative, trying not to make things worse. In that state, your instinct is to answer quickly and politely. That instinct feels right. It feels like the safe choice. But here's where it becomes risky, because speed replaces awareness, and awareness is the only thing protecting you in that moment. Think about how most people answer. I'm coming from work. I was at dinner. I just left a friend's house. Simple, harmless, normal. That's exactly why they feel safe. But the problem isn't the answer itself. It's what the answer connects to. The officer isn't just listening for information. They are building a mental timeline. Time of night, location, direction of travel, your appearance, your tone, your response speed. All of it gets layered together in seconds. Now imagine this. You say you're coming from dinner. It's very late. The area you're in doesn't match the direction of any nearby restaurants. That doesn't prove anything by itself, but it creates a gap, and gaps invite questions. Now the officer asks something else. What restaurant? Now you have to think. Even if you're telling the truth, the pause matters, because hesitation, even when innocent, can look like uncertainty. And uncertainty is what extends the interaction. Now you're not just answering a question, you're maintaining a narrative. And maintaining a narrative under pressure is where mistakes happen. Not big mistakes, small ones. A detail changes slightly. A time doesn't match exactly. A location sounds vague. And those small things don't stay small, they stack. Let me take you deeper into how this really works. Officers are trained to look for consistency more than anything else, not perfection. Consistency. Does your story stay the same? Does your tone match your words? Do your answers flow naturally, or do they feel constructed? Because when something feels constructed, even slightly, attention increases. And attention changes everything. Now, here's a mistake that quietly causes problems more often than people realize. Over-explaining. Some drivers think that if they give more detail, they will seem more cooperative. So instead of answering simply, they add layers. I just left work, then I stopped by a gas station, then I went to pick up food, then I took a different route because traffic was bad. That sounds helpful in their mind. But in reality, they've just created multiple points that can be questioned. More detail means more chances for something to not line up perfectly. And the more you talk, the more you give the situation to work with. Now, let's shift perspective for a second. Imagine you're the officer. You stop a vehicle. You don't know the driver. You don't know their intentions. You don't know what happened before that moment. All you have is observation and communication. So, you ask a simple question to begin forming a picture. That's what this is. It's the beginning of a picture. And your answer is the first piece. Now here's where things can escalate without you realizing it. Certain answers introduce new elements into the situation. If you say you're coming from a bar, alcohol becomes part of the picture. If you say you were in a hurry, speed becomes part of the picture. If you say you're tired, fatigue becomes part of the picture. None of those things automatically mean you've done anything wrong, but they shift the focus. They give the officer a reason to observe more closely. And once observation increases, the interaction becomes more detailed. Now here's something most people misunderstand completely. They think the risk is saying something illegal, but that's not the real risk. The real risk is saying something that opens unnecessary paths. Because once those paths open, the stop rarely stays simple. Now let's walk through a realistic scenario that shows how this plays out. You're driving home at night. You get pulled over. The officer asks where you're coming from. You answer quickly, just hanging out. That sounds vague, so they ask, where exactly? Now you feel pressure. You add more detail. At a friend's place. They ask where that is. You hesitate for a second. You try to remember the address. Your tone shifts slightly. Now the interaction has changed, not dramatically, but enough to increase attention. And once attention increases, the stop naturally becomes longer. More questions, more observation, more interaction, all from one simple answer that wasn't thought through. Now compare that to someone who stays calm and controlled. They don't rush. They don't over-explain. They respond in a way that doesn't create unnecessary expansion. Same question, completely different direction, because the response didn't open extra doors. Now, let's talk about the legal side for a moment, because this is where people start to understand the real weight of this situation. You are generally required to provide identification during a lawful traffic stop, but not every question carries the same obligation. And how you handle voluntary questions can affect how the interaction unfolds. That doesn't mean being uncooperative. It means being aware. There's a difference. And that difference is what protects you. Now here's something that might surprise you. Silence alone is not a strategy, and talking too much is not a strategy either. The real strategy is controlled communication, knowing when to speak, how much to say, and what not to expand on unnecessarily. Because once you start expanding, you can't take it back. Now, let me ask you something again. Have you ever answered that question quickly, just to get it over with, without realizing that your answer might actually make the stop longer instead of shorter? Because that's exactly what happens in many cases. People try to speed things up, but their words do the opposite. They slow everything down. Now, here's the shift that changes everything. Stop treating that question like small talk. Start recognizing it as the beginning of a structured interaction. Once you see it that way, you stop reacting automatically. You pause, even if it's just for a second. And that pause gives you control. Control over your tone, control over your words, control over how much information you introduce. And that control is what keeps the situation from expanding unnecessarily, because once it expands, it rarely shrinks back. And by the time most people realize that, they've already said more than they needed to. And that's how a simple question turns into something much bigger than anyone expected.